In the book of Genesis, chapter 6, and in verse 8, there is a word that all Christians are interested in, and even those who are non-Christians. It's the word grace. And it says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." And what could the Lord have been referring to when he said that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord? There was a very interesting situation taking place back then, and it is that the descendants of Adam and Eve, they were so far from God that they were corrupted in a great way. And in verse 5 it tells us, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." In other words, when mankind gets to the point where their mind is controlled by sexual impurity and bad desires and bad words and bad actions and so on, it's like a warning from God. You are at the door of the second coming of Christ. Jesus said, when men are in the same condition as they were before the storm, or when people are like back in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Lot came out, judgment fell upon them. And what was predominating in the people before the storm and in the times of Lot was sexual promiscuity. Today, you could see parades where there are multitudes, where they're not ashamed of their sin, but they're proclaiming their sin to the four winds as though it were the greatest virtue on earth, to act against the very nature God has given us. But in the midst of that corruption, the Bible tells us that God, He found a man who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And that man was Noah. Now, the word grace, it means an undeserved favor of God. Grace is something that you obtain not because you worked hard for it, not because you had a character and the right behavior, but it's just that God saw you with His eyes of mercy and He extended His favor to you. Something similar we could find in the life of Queen Esther when she presented herself before the king without him inviting her in. And acting like that, it meant that she was exposing to finding grace or being executed. There was no middle ground. Either we are touched by God's grace or we are affected by divine judgment. And if the king was to extend his scepter to her, the queen would find grace. And like the story teaches us, the king did extend his golden scepter to her, and she received grace. And he said, "Tell me, what is your request? I will give you even up to half of my kingdom." And so Esther used that grace for the redemption of her people, because there was a decree to exterminate them. And Noah, he used God's grace for the preservation of mankind, because by finding grace, he and his family stepped into the ark that they built, and by doing so, their life was preserved. Mankind was preserved. Otherwise, we would have all disappeared in that judgment that God sent through the storm, universal storm. So grace is God's undeserved favor for every one of us. And then the Apostle John in chapter 1, he said, or he gave a very powerful teaching. He said, the law came through Moses, but grace and mercy came through Jesus Christ. In other words, Jesus, through the redeeming work that He did by His love, He gave His life for every single one of us. John explains it a little down the line in chapter 3 and verse 16 when he says that all those that believe in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. In other words, we don't have to work to obtain salvation. We just have to believe what Jesus did and extend our hands and say, Lord, I take hold of your full blessing for my life. And when we take hold of that blessing, we are going to be saved and we will be beneficiaries of God's grace. Now, if you have not reached God's grace, you are in time. You just have to open your heart to Jesus and invite Him in, that He could come in and save you. May the Lord bless.